The farmer's hands were covered in blood, his own and the lioness's, as he worked desperately to cut through the wire snare that had nearly severed her leg, knowing that one wrong movement would trigger an attack that would kill him instantly. But 6 weeks later, when she returned heavily pregnant and gave birth to 3 cubs inside his barn, choosing his protection over any wild den, he understood that the 4 hours he had spent saving her life had created a bond that would span 3 generations and prove that some acts of compassion create ripples that never stop spreading. To understand how we arrived at this moment that would challenge everything wildlife behaviorists thought they knew about wild lion trust and maternal den selection, we need to go back to a Tuesday morning in rural Tanzania when farmer Joseph Massawe was checking his fence lines that bordered the Selous Game Reserve. Joseph was 52 years old, a subsistence farmer who grew maize and kept a small herd of goats, a man whose life had been shaped by the constant balance between coexisting with wildlife and protecting his livelihood from the predators that sometimes viewed his livestock as easier prey than wild game. He was walking the northern boundary of his property, looking for breaks in the fence that might allow his goats to wander into dangerous territory or wild animals to access his crops, when he heard a sound that made him stop and listen carefully. It was low, rhythmic, a kind of pained breathing that suggested an animal in distress. Joseph's first thought was that one of his goats had gotten stuck in brush or injured itself, and he moved toward the sound with the intention of providing help or at least ending suffering if injury proved too severe. What he found instead made him freeze in absolute terror. A lioness was lying approximately 20 meters from his fence line, her body positioned in a way that communicated extreme distress. And when Joseph looked closer, he saw why. Her right hind leg was caught in a wire snare trap, the kind that illegal poachers set throughout the region to catch antelope and other game, but that frequently trapped non-target animals, including lions. The wire had tightened around her leg just above the ankle, cutting through fur and skin and deep into muscle, creating a wound that was bleeding steadily and had clearly been deteriorating for days. The lioness saw Joseph at the same moment he saw her, and her body language shifted immediately from pain-focused to threat-aware. She tried to stand, to position herself defensively, but the snare prevented full movement, and the attempt caused obvious agony that made her vocalize, a sound halfway between growl and cry that communicated both warning and suffering. Joseph took several steps backward, his mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. The right thing to do was to contact wildlife authorities to let professionals handle this dangerous situation. But the nearest wildlife office was 4 hours away, and this lioness didn't have 4 hours. She was dying slowly, from blood loss and infection and the trauma of being trapped for what appeared to be at least 3 days, based on the condition of her wound. Joseph stood there for several long minutes, farmer and dying predator regarding each other across a distance that felt both too close and impossibly far, and made a decision that his family would later say was either the bravest or most foolish choice of his life. He was going to try to free her, alone, without sedation or professional equipment, or any real plan beyond the basic principle that leaving a suffering animal to die when help was possible felt wrong in ways his conscience couldn't accept. He walked back to his farm compound, gathered supplies, wire cutters from his tool shed, antiseptic and bandages from the veterinary kit he kept for his goats, heavy gloves that might provide minimal protection, a length of rope, and returned to where the lioness waited. She was still there, still trapped, her breathing more labored than it had been 30 minutes earlier, her eyes tracking his approach with wariness that seemed to blend fear and desperate hope in equal measure. Joseph spoke to her continuously as he approached, his voice low and calm, words in Swahili that she couldn't understand, but that he hoped would communicate non-threat through tone if nothing else. "I'm here to help you," he said. "I know you're scared and in pain. I know I'm a human and humans put you in this trap. But I'm going to get you out. Please don't kill me for trying." When he was close enough to see the full extent of her injuries, Joseph felt his stomach turn. The wire had cut nearly to the bone, creating a circumferential wound that had swollen grotesquely, the flesh around the snare infected and discolored in ways that suggested gangrene might already be setting in. If he freed her and she survived, she would likely lose the leg or at least suffer permanent damage, that would compromise her hunting ability. But leaving her meant certain death, so he focused on the immediate problem of removing the snare without triggering an attack that would end with him being mauled by a terrified predator. Joseph knelt approximately 2 meters from the lioness, close enough to reach the snare with his wire cutters, but far enough that he might have a chance to react if she lunged. She watched him with intensity that made every hair on his neck stand up, her body coiled with tension, clearly debating whether he represented help or additional threat. He extended the wire cutters slowly, speaking continuously, his hands shaking despite efforts to keep them steady. "I need to cut this wire," he told her. "What, it's going to hurt when the tension releases. You're probably going to want to attack me. Please don't. I'm trying to save your life." The wire was thick, designed to hold struggling antelope, wrapped multiple times around the lioness's leg in loops that had tightened progressively as she fought to escape. Joseph positioned the cutters on the section of wire closest to him, applied pressure, and made the first cut. The wire snapped with a sharp sound that made both human and lion flinch, the sudden release of tension causing the lioness to cry out in pain and lunge reflexively toward Joseph. He fell backward, scrambling away, certain he was about to die, but the remaining loops of wire still held her leg and prevented her from reaching him. She strained against the trap, making sounds of frustration and agony while Joseph lay in the grass, breathing hard and trying to convince his heart to slow down. He had to keep going. That first cut had relieved some pressure, but the lioness was still trapped, still suffering, still dying if he didn't finish what he'd started. Joseph approached again, slower this time, speaking more urgently. "I know that hurt. I'm sorry, but there's more wire. I need to cut all of it or you're still going to die here. Please let me finish." He positioned the cutters on the second loop, made the cut, braced for another lunge that didn't come. The lioness was watching him now with expression that seemed different, less threat-focused and more attentive, as if she was beginning to understand that the pain from wire cutting was temporary, while the pain from the trap was constant. Cut by cut, loop by loop, Joseph worked his way through the snare, each release bringing visible relief despite the associated pain. His hands were bleeding from where sharp wire ends had caught his skin through the gloves. His clothes were soaked with sweat, despite the morning coolness. His entire body was shaking from adrenaline and fear, and the physical strain of maintaining precise control while terrified. After what felt like hours but was probably 40 minutes, he cut the final loop, and the snare fell away completely, leaving the lioness's leg free but devastatingly injured. She could have killed him then. The trap was gone. She was free to move, and Joseph was kneeling close enough that one pounce would end his life before he could react. But instead of attacking, the lioness did something that Joseph would never be able to explain fully. She pulled her injured leg close to her body, looked at Joseph with eyes that seemed to communicate understanding, and made a low vocalization that sounded nothing like threat and everything like acknowledgement. Then she stood on 3 legs, turned out and began limping away into the bush, moving slowly but deliberately away from the farmer who had freed her. Joseph sat there in the grass for a long time after she disappeared, his mind trying to process what had just happened, his hands still shaking, his body flooded with chemicals that came from dancing with death and somehow surviving. He gathered the cut wire as evidence to report to anti-poaching authorities, cleaned his own wounds with the antiseptic he had brought for the lioness, but never gotten to use, and walked home, feeling like he had just experienced something significant that he didn't fully understand. He told his wife about the rescue, showed her his bleeding hands, described the lioness's final look before she walked away. "You're insane," she said, but there was admiration mixed with the fear in her voice. "That lion could have killed you a dozen times. You're the luckiest fool in Tanzania." Weeks passed. Joseph reported the snare to wildlife authorities, who documented it as part of ongoing anti-poaching efforts, but who were skeptical about his story of freeing a lioness alone without being attacked. He returned to his normal routine of farming, occasionally thinking about the lioness and wondering if she had survived her injuries or if infection and inability to hunt had claimed her despite his rescue. He assumed he would never know, that wild animals weren't like domestic ones who returned to show gratitude, that his rescue would be just a story he told occasionally about the time he did something brave and foolish in equal measure. If you're feeling the intensity of this impossible rescue, if you understand the risk Joseph took approaching a trapped predator without sedation or weapons, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Because what happens 6 weeks later will prove that some animals remember kindness with clarity that science struggles to explain. And the choice this lioness makes about where to give birth will create a bond spanning 3 generations that challenges everything we thought we knew about wild lion behavior and trust. 6 weeks after the rescue, Joseph was working in his barn organizing feed for his goats when he heard his wife calling his name with urgency that made him drop everything and run. She was standing at the barn entrance, frozen, pointing toward something he couldn't initially see. "There's a lion," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the compound, coming toward the barn. Joseph, what do we do?" Joseph looked where she was pointing and felt his heart stop. A lioness was walking across his compound, moving slowly, her gait awkward in ways that suggested injury or pain, heading directly toward the open barn where he was standing. His first thought was that this was a dangerous situation requiring immediate retreat. His second thought was to look for identifying features that might tell him if this was the same lioness he had freed from the snare. She was close enough now that he could see her right hind leg, and the sight made him gasp audibly. The leg bore obvious scarring, healed but permanent, the pattern matching exactly where the wire snare had cut nearly to bone 6 weeks earlier. It was her. She had survived, and she was coming to his barn deliberately, with purpose that suggested this wasn't random wandering or hunting behavior. Joseph positioned himself protectively in front of his wife, ready to pull her inside and slam the barn door if the lioness showed aggression, but also curious about what this visit meant. The lioness stopped approximately 10 meters from the barn entrance, close enough that eye contact was clear and direct, and looked at Joseph with expression that seemed to communicate recognition. She made a low vocalization, that same sound he remembered from the moment after he freed her, acknowledgement without threat. Then Joseph noticed something that made the entire situation make sudden sense. The lioness was heavily pregnant, her sides swollen in ways that suggested she was very close to giving birth, possibly within days or even hours. She was looking between Joseph and the barn, her body language suggesting she was assessing the space, making a decision about something that felt significant. "She's pregnant," Joseph said to his wife. I think she's looking for a place to have her cubs." The lioness made another vocalization, then took several steps toward the barn entrance, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in pain or carrying heavy weight. Joseph's wife grabbed his arm. "Don't let her in the barn. Joseph, this is insane. She's a wild lion. She can't give birth here." But Joseph was already moving backward, pulling his wife with him, creating space for the lioness to enter if that was her choice. "She saved my life by not attacking me when I freed her," he said. "Now she needs a safe place for her cubs. How can I deny her that?" The lioness entered the barn, her eyes sweeping the space, assessing the stacked hay, the feeding troughs, the sheltered areas that would provide protection from elements and other predators. She moved to the far corner, to a spot where hay bales created a natural enclosure that offered both visibility and security, and began circling in the way that pregnant animals do when preparing a birthing spot. Joseph watched in amazement, understanding that he was witnessing a choice that wildlife behaviorists would struggle to explain. This wild lioness, who should have been seeking a cave or dense brush for denning, had instead traveled to a human structure and was preparing to give birth where a farmer who had saved her life could provide protection. "We need to leave her alone," Joseph told his wife. "She's chosen this spot. She trusts us enough to be vulnerable here. We can't violate that trust by hovering. We'll check on her periodically from a distance, but we let her have privacy and space." They backed out of the barn slowly, the lioness watching them go but showing no aggression or distress, her attention already shifting to the contractions that were beginning as her body prepared for birth. Over the next 12 hours, Joseph made quiet checks every few hours, approaching the barn cautiously, looking through gaps in the walls rather than entering, giving the lioness privacy while ensuring she was okay. He saw her labor progress, heard the sounds that birthing mammals make regardless of species, felt the weight of witnessing something extraordinary. By morning, the lioness had delivered 3 cubs, 2 males and 1 female, tiny squirming things that made high-pitched sounds as they sought their mother's warmth and milk. She cleaned them with her rough tongue, moved them into position against her belly, settled into the hay with her newborns with an expression that looked like relief and contentment. Joseph's first instinct was to contact wildlife authorities, to report that a wild lioness had given birth in his barn, to let professionals decide how to handle this unprecedented situation. But something stopped him. The lioness had chosen his barn specifically, had traveled here deliberately when she could have denned anywhere in the vast wilderness surrounding his farm. She had trusted him with her most vulnerable moment. Reporting her felt like betrayal of that trust, like inviting intervention that might harm rather than help. He made a different choice. He would protect her privacy, provide support if she needed it, and let her make her own decisions about when to leave. The arrangement that developed over the following 3 weeks was unlike anything documented in wildlife literature. The lioness stayed in the barn with her cubs, nursing them, keeping them warm, occasionally leaving for brief periods to hunt or drink, but always returning within hours. Joseph provided water in a large basin positioned near but not too close to her chosen corner, left the barn door partially open so she had freedom to come and go, made sure his goats were secured elsewhere so there was no predator-prey stress. His wife thought he was insane, but also recognized something sacred happening in their barn that deserved respect rather than interference. Joseph would enter the barn daily to tend to his farming needs, moving carefully, speaking continuously so the lioness always knew where he was, giving her space while also maintaining his normal routines in a way that communicated he wasn't a threat. The lioness watched him but showed no aggression, her body language suggesting she understood the difference between the human who had saved her and humans who might threaten her cubs. Over time, she became so comfortable with his presence that she would nurse her cubs while he worked 20 feet away, an acceptance that felt like mutual respect rather than habituation. By the 3rd week, the cubs were mobile enough to explore their hay bale den, stumbling on unsteady legs, playing with each other in the ways that all young predators do as they learn coordination and hunting instincts. Joseph would watch them from a distance, marveling at the privilege of witnessing lion cubs in their earliest days, understanding that he was seeing something most people would never experience. The lioness would watch him watching her cubs, and in those moments, Joseph felt a connection that transcended species, a shared understanding that they were both protecting these young lives in their own ways. On day 21, Joseph entered the barn in the morning to find the lioness standing, her body language communicating readiness to move. The cubs were more coordinated now, able to walk steadily, old enough to travel short distances. She looked at Joseph directly, made that vocalization of acknowledgement, then carefully picked up one cub by the scruff of its neck and carried it out of the barn. She made 3 trips, transporting each cub individually to wherever she had decided was their next location, and then she returned one final time. She stood in the barn entrance, looked at Joseph for a long moment that felt like goodbye and gratitude combined, then turned and walked away with the distinctive limp that would mark her for life as the lioness who had survived a snare trap and trusted a human enough to den with her cubs in his barn. Share this story with someone who believes in trust that defies logic, in gratitude that expresses itself through vulnerability, and in bonds that create legacies spanning generations, because what happens years later when one of those cubs returns will prove that some trust is passed through bloodlines, and some rescue creates ripples that never stop spreading through time and family. Joseph returned to his normal life, occasionally telling the story of the 3 weeks when a wild lioness raised her cubs in his barn, showing visitors the hay bale corner where she had denned, describing the moment when she carried each cub out one by one before saying goodbye. Most people were skeptical, assuming exaggeration or fabrication, but Joseph had photographs his wife had taken from a distance and the physical evidence of the disturbed hay and the water basin that had been regularly depleted. Something extraordinary had happened in that barn, and whether people believed it or not, didn't change the reality of what Joseph had witnessed. 2 years passed. Joseph had begun to think that the barn denning was a singular event, a unique circumstance that wouldn't be repeated. Then one evening, his wife called him to the compound fence. "And there's a lioness watching the property," she said. "She's been there for 20 minutes, just sitting and watching." Joseph grabbed binoculars and looked toward where his wife was pointing. A young adult lioness was indeed sitting approximately 50 meters from their fence, and even from that distance, Joseph could see distinctive features that made his breath catch. She had a slight limp in her right hind leg, not pronounced but noticeable, and her build matched what he remembered of one of the 3 cubs, the female, that had been born in his barn 2 years earlier. She was watching the property with attention that suggested recognition rather than random interest. Joseph walked to the fence, not crossing it but standing where she could see him clearly, and called out, "I know who you are. You were born in my barn. Your mother trusted me." "What do you need?" The young lioness stood, took several steps closer, then stopped and made a vocalizing sound that was different from threat or fear. It sounded like communication, like an attempt to convey something important. Over the following days, the pattern became clear. The young lioness, Joseph, began calling her Zawadi, Swahili for gift, would appear near the farm in the evenings, watching from a respectful distance, occasionally moving closer, but never crossing the fence line without clear invitation. She was pregnant, her sides beginning to show the swelling that indicated cubs developing, and Joseph understood with wonder and humility that she was doing exactly what her mother had done. She was coming to the place where she had been born, seeking the safety that her mother had found here, preparing to den in proximity to the human who had become associated in her family's history with protection and trust. Joseph made a decision that his wife supported with resigned acceptance. If Zawadi wanted to den near their property, he would create space for her that respected both her wild nature and her apparent desire for the security this location represented. He cleared out a section of his barn that was separate from the area where the original lioness had denned, positioned hay bales to create a sheltered corner that offered privacy and protection, set up water access, and then simply waited to see if Zawadi would accept this offering. 2 weeks later, on a night when rain was falling heavily enough to turn the savannah into temporary marsh, Zawadi entered the barn. Joseph heard her come in, listened to her moving around, assessing the prepared space, held his breath waiting to see if she would stay or leave. The sounds of her circling and settling told him she had made her choice. She was denning in his barn, just as her mother had, creating the second generation of a trust that defied every standard understanding of wild lion behavior toward humans. The cubs, 4 this time, more than the typical 3 that lionesses usually birth, were born on a Tuesday morning during the rainy season. Joseph maintained the same protocol he had established with Zawadi's mother. Privacy, respect, providing water and security but not interfering, allowing the lioness to hunt and move freely while knowing her cubs were safe in a protected location. The difference this time was that Joseph understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't a singular event but a pattern, a legacy being passed from mother to daughter, trust being transmitted through bloodlines in ways that suggested lions had more complex social learning than science typically attributed to them. Zawadi stayed 4 weeks with her cubs, slightly longer than her mother had, perhaps because the rainy season made hunting more challenging, or perhaps because her familiarity with this location from her own cubhood made her more comfortable extending her stay. Joseph documented everything this time, taking careful notes about behavior, photographing from respectful distance with permission from wildlife authorities he had finally contacted after Zawadi's arrival. The researchers who came to observe were stunned by what they witnessed. A wild lioness raising cubs in a human structure, showing no stress or defensive aggression toward the farmer who worked nearby, demonstrating trust that shouldn't be possible between predator and human. Dr. Sarah Kimathi, a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Dar es Salaam who came to document the situation, spent a week observing before writing her preliminary report. This represents potentially unprecedented evidence of cultural transmission in wild lions, she wrote. The daughter is replicating her mother's denning choice not through genetic programming, but through learned behavior and memory of her own birth location. She associates this site with safety at such fundamental level that she's overriding normal wild lion wariness of humans and human structures. The farmer, Joseph Massawe, has become part of their family history, a known safe presence that 3 generations have now trusted with their most vulnerable cubs. When Zawadi finally carried her 4 cubs out of the barn one by one, making the same trips her mother had made to relocate them to wild territory, she did something her mother hadn't done. She returned alone one final time, approached Joseph where he was working in his field, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her, and pressed her head briefly against the fence between them before turning and disappearing into the savannah. Joseph stood there with tears running down his face, understanding that he had just been given the closest thing to a thank you that a wild lion could offer: physical contact that demonstrated trust at a level most humans would never experience with wild predators. The story attracted international attention when Dr. Kimathi published her findings. News organizations covered it. Documentary filmmakers requested access. Conservation groups used it as evidence of the complex emotional and cognitive capacity of lions that made their protection critical beyond just ecosystem arguments. Joseph became somewhat famous in conservation circles, invited to speak at conferences, asked to consult on human-wildlife coexistence programs. He approached the attention with humility, insisting he wasn't special, that he had simply responded to suffering with compassion and been fortunate that the lioness had chosen to trust rather than attack. 3 years after Zawadi's cubs were born in the barn, Joseph was working his field when he saw multiple lions approaching his property. His first reaction was alarm. A pride of lions meant danger beyond what a single animal represented. But as they got closer, he began recognizing individuals. Zawadi was there, now a mature lioness in her prime. And with her were 3 young adults, 2 males and 1 female, approximately the right age to be cubs from her barn birthing. They stopped at the fence line, the entire family group watching Joseph with attention that suggested this wasn't coincidence or random wandering. This was a visit, deliberate and purposeful. The young female among them stepped forward from the group, her body language suggesting both confidence and curiosity. And Joseph realized with wonder that she was approaching the fence in the same way her mother had, the same way her grandmother had, 3 generations of female lions coming to this location with trust that seemed to be transmitted through family teaching. She was pregnant, her sides already showing early swelling, and Joseph understood that the pattern might continue, that this 3rd-generation lioness might choose his barn for her own cubs if the family's cultural transmission of trust persisted. And she did. 5 months later, the granddaughter of the lioness Joseph had freed from a wire snare, gave birth to 2 cubs in the same barn, in a prepared corner that Joseph now maintained permanently, because it had become clear this was no longer his barn alone, but a shared space between his farming operation and a family of lions who had incorporated his property into their generational knowledge as a safe denning site. The wildlife researchers documenting this 3rd generation's use of the barn were observing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about wild lion behavior and cultural learning. Dr. Kimathi's follow-up paper, published in a major wildlife biology journal, was titled Multi-Generational Trust and Denning Site Selection in Wild Lions, a Case Study of Cultural Transmission. The abstract captured the significance. 3 consecutive generations of wild lionesses have chosen the same human structure for denning, demonstrating learned transmission of location knowledge and trust associations that persist across multiple reproductive cycles. This challenges existing models of wild lion behavior and suggests cultural learning capacity previously undocumented in this species. The original rescue event appears to have created lasting trust association, transmitted from mother to daughter to granddaughter, indicating that individual positive experiences with humans can shape family group behavior across decades. Joseph lived to see 4 generations of lions use his barn for denning, each generation learning from the previous that this location represented safety during their most vulnerable time. The barn became informally protected by wildlife authorities who recognized its significance as a research site and conservation education opportunity. Tour groups would visit, standing at respectful distance while Joseph explained the history, showed them the denning corner, described the moment when he spent 4 hours freeing a trapped lioness and created a legacy that would extend beyond his lifetime. When Joseph died at age 73, the conservation community mourned him as someone who had demonstrated that human-wildlife coexistence was possible through compassion and respect. The barn was maintained by his children as a memorial and continued research site. The denning corner permanently marked with a plaque that read, "Here, 4 generations of wild lionesses chose to trust a farmer with their cubs." Joseph Massawe, 1969-2042, freed a trapped lioness in 2021 and created a legacy of compassion that changed how we understand wild lions and the bonds possible between human and wild when crisis becomes opportunity for connection. The 5th-generation lioness, great-great-granddaughter of the original trapped lioness, gave birth in the barn 3 months after Joseph's death. She had never met him, knew him only through the cultural knowledge transmitted through her mother's line. Yet she chose the same location her ancestors had, demonstrating that the trust Joseph created had become so embedded in this family's behavior that it persisted even after the original human was gone. The researchers observing documented that she showed no distress at Joseph's absence, suggesting the trust was tied to the location itself rather than to individual human, though Joseph's children reported that she seemed to search briefly for him before settling into the familiar denning corner. The barn stands today as a working conservation research station and education center, still owned by Joseph's family but operated in partnership with wildlife organizations. The denning corner sees a new generation of cubs every few years, the lioness family continuing to pass down the knowledge that this specific human structure represents safety during the vulnerable weeks after birth. Visitors come from around the world to witness the place where a farmer's 4 hours of dangerous compassion created a legacy spanning generations and proved that some rescues create ripples that never stop. Some trust becomes culture that outlives individuals, and some bonds between human and wild become family stories, passed from mother to daughter across decades and bloodlines. The original wire snare that Joseph cut from the trapped lioness is preserved in the education center, mounted beside photographs documenting the 4 generations of cubs born in the barn. Visual representation of how one moment of choice between walking away and offering help created a connection that transformed understanding of what's possible between humans and wild predators. When compassion meets suffering and creates something neither species could have predicted, but both somehow recognized as sacred.